We're delighted to have you here, and I'm delighted to introduce our friend and colleague, Dan Drasin.
Thanks, Rich. So, welcome. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to show a slideshow, which is mainly my cheat sheet for this talk, and which also includes some short previews of videos that I've produced. And then we can have a Q&A afterwards. Feel free to ask any questions or whatever. First of all, my name is Dan Drasin. I have been, professionally, I've been excuse me, a media producer and cameraman and audio guy and writer pretty much all my life, although this is the first book I've actually written. And of a parallel to my professional career, I've always had an interest in stuff, in what's not authorized by our culture, let's put it that way. As a child, I had a number of precognitive dreams, and while I couldn't understand what that was, it was enough to let me know that in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage. That there's more to reality, certainly, than we perceive with our senses. And even beyond that, of course, science for the last 400 years has demonstrated that there's more to reality than what we perceive with our senses. But even science, for all of its philosophical and practical advantages, sometimes can ossify into a religion that sets up barriers as to what's possible, what's thinkable, and so on. I don't think I have to illustrate that for anyone here. Anyway, around about the 1990s, I became interested in a phenomenon called instrumental transcommunication. And what that is communication from the other side through electronics. This has been going on since at least the 1950s. And people hearing voices on their recorded tapes and through radios and so on that they couldn't account for. And it turns out that these voices are from what we call the other side. You'll see a little bit about that in the preview of my documentary here in this show. But actually, why don't we just launch right into this? And please, at any time, feel free to raise your hands and we can answer any questions. Okay, first of all, does anyone here doubt the existence of an afterlife? Oh, great, I'm preaching to the choir.
What do you mean by an afterlife?
Well, what would you mean? What do you think it means when we use that word?
Well, I've been into non-duality, and it's really about there not really being this to be an afterlife. It's kind of impersonal. And if it's a personal afterlife, I did that way back in Catholic school. But so it really depends on what you mean by that.
Exactly, and I thank you for bringing that up because I don't actually like the word afterlife. I think it's too restrictive. It kind of makes the afterlife seem like, that tail that kids used to pin on the donkeys, that little extra little appendage, right? A little thing that's tacked on to the end of our real lives, right? And I think that's misleading for reasons which I think probably all of you here can understand. Perhaps each in your own way. We all have our own conceptions and ideas and feelings about this, and it's not my job to standardize that, as far as I'm concerned. And I say this very explicitly in my book, that everyone has a right to their own experience. Do not take anything in my book as gospel. Read 1,000 books. Talk to people who've had experiences. Dive into your own experiences if you've had them. And try not to come to any dead ends. So, onward. Anyway, guess what? We're all going to die. But fortunately, but how do we know that's true? Well, for some, it's a matter of intuition or belief. For near-death experiencers, witnesses to afterlife manifestations, it's a matter of direct experience. And for the rest of us, for people who are just kind of on the border or on the edge, honest scientific investigation can be a good way to familiarize ourselves with it. So, big question. How do we bring science to bear on something that isn't even considered real in our materialistically oriented culture? Materialism says the whole of reality is based in matter. But this is an unproven belief system or assumption about reality. And in its own way, it constitutes a de facto world religion that's rarely, if ever, questioned. As physics moves into accepting, for example, quantum mechanics, which is kind of a halfway realm between physical reality as we relate to it and the realm of consciousness, it's beginning to open up a little bit. But there's still a lot of rigidity and pressure in the scientific community, and particularly in the academic communities, about this. Anyway, so where do we go with this? I think the most important thing to point out is that science isn't necessarily materialistic. It's a method of inquiry. I like to think of it as organized curiosity. It can mean any systematic inquiry to maximize useful knowledge, experience, and insight, and minimize error, illusion, or self-deception. It can be supported by stringent methods, or it can be as simple as trying something to find out whether it works or not, rather than blindly taking someone else's word for it. Okay, I want to be scientific about this. I'm going to try it myself. So, science is universal. It's free to ask questions and collect evidence about anything under the sun and beyond. And it's in this spirit that I wrote A New Science of the Afterlife. In a playful way, the book addresses some of the social, philosophical, and linguistic barriers that impede our society's access to vitally important post-materialist research and information, including the question of an afterlife. Now, quantum physics is kind of on the edge of what we call post-materialism. I think that's fairly easy to understand. The book takes a radical look at language, with which we unconsciously construct our picture of reality, including both mundane and metaphysical phenomena and events. The book spotlights particular words whose meanings we tend to take for granted, such as da-da-da-da-da. We each give reality to these words in a certain way. And one of the most important word pairs here is separation versus distinction. Separation gives us the idea of complete and utter separateness, disconnection. Distinction is more subtle. And personally, I think the way that reality and creation work is by distinction rather than separation. So the more we think in terms of that, you and I are simply two adjacent waves in the ocean, we're both the ocean. Our energy has added to our form, our physical form, obviously, but at the root of our being, we're all parts of the same ocean. Not separate parts, but merely distinct parts. Another favorite of mine is the veil. What's the veil? We talk about communications from beyond the veil.
The body.
The body. Any other? To me, it's our senses, which are tuned just to a very narrow band of reality. And when I work with a particular team of very talented mediums, and they're always reminding me that the other side isn't out there in some, distant place in space. It's all around us. And those who we communicate with on the other side are, standing, as it were, right here around us. Just that we can't see them. For the most part, our instruments can't see them, but that's changing, and you'll see a little bit about that in my film. Okay, anything else here? Let's go on. Let's hold on this for a second. Yeah, another one of my favorite semantic issues is we talk about anybody, somebody, nobody. Every time we repeat these words, don't they reinforce the idea that we're nothing but our bodies? I mean, you know, you say someone, anyone, no one, that's very different. Oh, another one of my favorite whipping boys is the skeptics. Skepticism, so-called skepticism, has been a problem in the culture. You turn on your TV and you see someone who's trying to convey an experience, whether it's a psychic experience or afterlife communication or a UFO experience. The producer has to bring on a skeptic to balance the issue and to say, well, that's impossible, so it's all a bunch of rubbish. I probably don't need to explain that much further to anyone here. Okay. I'm going on the more positive side. There are quite a number of areas of post-materialist research that are currently underway or have been for some time, actually. And the book goes into each of these in some detail. Anyone familiar with autistic savants? Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. These are folks who can pull, impossible mathematical solutions out of the air in 2 seconds. Some of them can remember everything they did every moment of every day in their lives. And we don't have access to that. So what's the difference? Well, for one thing, many autistic savants have diminished brain matter. Some of them are hydrocephalic, which means most of their inside of their skull is liquid. There's a very small amount of brain tissue. Yet they function fine and they have instant access to all this information. So what does that tell us? Terminal lucidity. That's it's something that's really been recognized only relatively recently. And it's a phenomenon where when someone is on their deathbed, shortly before they pass, they'll go through a period of complete lucidity, complete normalcy, even if they've had severe brain damage. All of a sudden, they're themselves again, and they relate to their relatives and loved ones in the room, and the hospital staff, and then they pass. So what's going on there? Is this perhaps another clue that consciousness isn't really generated by the brain after all? Something different? The shared death experience. This is where someone in the room with a dying person, again, it could be a relative or a hospital staff at times, they will either witness the individual leaving their body and going into their afterlife, or they will accompany them into the first stage of the afterlife. And this is the sort of thing that, it's one of many things that happens in hospitals that the doctors don't want to know about. Some years ago I was thinking of making a documentary about some women I had met who were nurses in a children's cancer ward. And they were telling me about all kinds of very interesting things they observed, which they had to keep to themselves. And I was going to title the documentary, "Don't Tell the Doctor." Okay, psychedelics need no introduction. They demonstrate that our consciousness is not wedded to our ordinary perceptions, and fortunately, in recent years, they have come out of legal limbo, and people are making wonderful discoveries, both in the therapeutic arena and elsewhere. Another interesting thing about psychedelics across the board is that it's not quite as simple as this, but generally speaking, they operate as a function of reduced cerebral activity. So again, the idea of the brain being not the source of consciousness, but a sort of a transmitter-receiver and a conditioner of consciousness and a filter of consciousness. Okay, the placebo effect. Do our minds affect our bodies directly? No, you can't talk about that among the medical profession. Well, there's the placebo effect, right? I think we all know what that is. Drug company does clinical trials, and they have to structure them to allow for the placebo effect. So here is this, evidence for a psychic influence of the body that's hiding in plain sight. And its meaning is very often swept under the rug within the medical profession. Lucid dreaming. Everyone know what lucid dreaming is? Okay. One way of looking at it is like the kindergarten of the afterlife. It's a way in which we can experience the creativity of consciousness in a very direct way, where we can learn to play the music, as it were, of consciousness, and create realities for fun, for learning, for all kinds of purposes. Precognition and presentiment. This is a good one scientifically, because there have been studies that very clearly demonstrate that people can be aware of things before they happen. Anyone who's had precognitive dreams understands that. Sorry about that. I hit the button. Here we are. And there have been studies where people are shown a series on a computer screen. People are shown a series of images that are known to produce certain brainwave patterns. And in the experiments that I allude to in the book, the brainwave patterns show up a fraction of a second before the image appears. So that's interesting. It's not like long-term precognition, but it basically throws our ideas of time into question. And I think throwing things into question is much more important than arriving at conclusions. It was too early for much of that, at least in our culture. Clairvoyance or remote viewing. We probably all know about the CIA and Army's experiments in remote viewing that were conducted at SRI years ago, which produced actionable military intelligence. And that's kind of hard to debunk. Map dowsing. Map dowsing is where the location of an object or a person can be intuited in terms of positions on a map. A friend of mine was a musician, and she was playing a concert. She was a harpist, playing a concert in Oakland, and left her harp in a storage room in the theater overnight. She got there the next morning, it was gone. So her mother contacted one of the most outstanding map dowsers in the country, gave him the information, sent him a map, and he said, okay, put up reward posters in this 4 square block area in Oakland. And the harp came back in 24 hours. Telepathy needs no introduction. Okay. A particularly robust evidence for an afterlife, particularly. Near-death experience research, out-of-body experience research and practice. People can do it as some people do it naturally, some people do it as an experiment or as a discipline. Reincarnation research. That's been going on for years at the University of Virginia. Most of you probably are familiar with that program at the Division of Perceptual Studies. Oops.
I think the fact...
Sorry. Keep my hands off that keyboard. The book includes full chapters on outstandingly evidential reincarnation case, and also the subjects of my 2 recent documentary films. Calling Earth is about afterlife communication through electronics, and here's a little trailer for it.
I think the fact that we survive bodily death is a scientific fact. It's nothing to do with religion.
One day in the summer of 2002, Martha Copeland of Lawrenceville, Georgia, played back a sound recording she'd made earlier that day and heard the voice of her daughter Kathy disciplining her dog. That wouldn't have been so unusual, except that 6 months earlier, Kathy had died in an auto accident.
One evening, to my great surprise, with some equipment I was developing at the time, I heard a voice. I was really startled.
After the second or third test, I immediately got voices saying, "We are the dead, we are alive, we are able to think and to speak."
A brief definition of the electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP as we call it, would be the existence of voices of unknown origin which appear in tape recordings particularly, but could also be recorded in other ways.
It was the voice of my late father, and he addressed me with my nickname he used when I was a little boy.
Here was this voice that I recognized immediately as my mother.
Missing you, Cal. I know, great. Happy birthday. Love you. Happy New Year.
The voice then calls the experimenter's name, Konstantin Raudive.
This is Konstantin Raudive speaking. I'm as fine as a dead one can be.
The experimenter states that in his opinion, man cannot grasp the events after death with his intellect. A voice replies in German, kann. He can.
If somebody came up to me in the street and said, "There's nothing paranormal about EVP," I would say, "Well, I believe in experimental evidence. I've done at least 20 years and hundreds of experiments, and I know that it is a paranormal effect. Now, how many experiments have you done?"
When the phenomena expanded into pictures, faxes, computer messages, actual phone calls, another term had to be coined, and that became instrumental transcommunication, or ITC, which basically means communication through instruments.
International conferences held in the United States and Europe have drawn ITC experimenters, scientists, engineers, psychologists, and medical doctors from around the world who share their experiences, present the results of their research work, and discuss methods for better understanding the nature and meaning of ITC.
Whoa!
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness, this is very clear.
Oh, check that out. That's totally him. Oh my God.
It's objective evidence. So it has changed our lives completely.
Science appears to preclude the possibility of an afterlife, but science evolves and there's no knowing what possibilities may be acceptable to a future science.
Maybe it's a superstition, maybe it really happens. The only way to find out is to study the phenomenon and find out whether it happens or not.
We should be devoting enormous social resources to this question, not leaving it up to a matter of belief.
Now with AI out there, that's a whole new realm that people are going to start
claiming
bringing nonsense into this.
Right. Well, even without AI, there are various ways of messing with images and pretending that you've got something. My experience is that folks in the field, once they really get into it, there are really very few questions of integrity, at least that I've found personally. But the point is well taken that we have to we need solid evidence. We need high integrity in our investigations. We need to document things. All the things that that make for good science. And yes, it's easy to create belief systems on the basis of claims. I'm sure we've all run into that. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Well, historically, showing the audio tape that has something on it. There's, especially in home recordings, there's a problem with print through and erasures that are incomplete. So if you're going to be analytic and totally scientific about it, you have to eliminate those things.
Right.
So it's really tricky.
Yeah, we also have to eliminate things like a machine picking up a radio broadcast from a powerful station nearby. Actually, when this phenomenon was first discovered in the 1950s, and people were hearing these strange little voices on their tapes that didn't belong there, they were very often dismissed as, well, the machine's picking up a radio station. And that's how it was in the United States pretty much. But in Europe, these things were taken seriously. And things like radio pickup were ruled out easily. It was first, as far as we know, the first instance of this was recorded by a man named Friedrich Jürgensen, who was a Swedish documentary filmmaker, an actor, and opera singer. He was very well known at his time. And he was making a documentary about birds. And he went out with his new tape recorder one night, to record nocturnal bird sounds. When he played back the tape, he heard the bird sounds, and then between the bird sounds, he heard voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. And he thought this was quite a coincidence that some radio station would be talking about nocturnal bird sounds. And shortly thereafter, he heard the voice of his mother calling him by his childhood nickname, Friedel. So he kind of threw up his hands at that point and decided that this is something that really needed to be explored scientifically. So he just dove into it. He would roll his tape, he would ask a question, let some time go by, ask another question, and so on. And he'd play the tape back. And in the gaps, he would hear answers to his questions. At first they were kind of faint, but they were clear enough for him to make out that they were legitimate answers to his questions. And he recorded thousands of these examples. He was then joined by Konstantin Raudeva, who you saw very briefly in this clip, this Latvian researcher who worked with Jürgensen for a while and went off and did his own work. And by the time he passed in 1974, he recorded between 60 and 70,000 of these voices. So these were two among a whole community of experimenters, mainly in Europe. And in the United States, it was more used as a practice just to communicate, communicate with loved ones who'd passed. And in the film itself, there's quite a few examples of this. Now, to take this up to a more complex and interesting level, there's the whole field of what's called physical mediumship, where in these sessions, physical objects appear, there are physical manifestations that can be preserved or recorded and so on. They're very hard to debunk unless, which is true in some cases, there are cases of fraud and showmanship in that field. But it's not rocket science to really separate the wheat from the chaff in that field. Probably the most interesting and well-monitored experiment in physical mediumship was called the Skoll experiment, which took place in a small English village about a half-hour northeast of Cambridge in the county of Norfolk. between about 1994 and 1999, two couples sat in a particular prepared place for a total of 500 sessions over 5 years. For 2 years running, the sessions were observed by a team of skeptical investigators from the Society for Psychical Research in London, and they were unable to nail these people in any way in terms of fraud or faking or exaggeration. The sessions took place in almost complete darkness, but they were all recorded on audio tape, over 500 hours of audio tape. And in my documentary, there are some interesting and sometimes funny tidbits from these recordings. You'll hear a couple of them, I think, in this little trailer for the documentary.
The reality of ITC is strongly supported by the practice of physical mediumship, in which the surviving consciousness of deceased persons is claimed to produce various effects in our physical world, including sophisticated interactions with our audio and visual technologies.
In physical mediumship, phenomena happen of a physical nature, meaning objects move, things appear, disappear, things that people can see happening. There's an effect on real objective things.
For a closer look at physical mediumship, let's travel back in time to the late 1990s in the tiny English village of Skål, where the most extensive and long-running experiment ever attempted in afterlife communication unfolded over a 5-year period in the darkened cellar of this 17th century farmhouse. The Skål experiment was the brainchild of two veteran afterlife researchers, Robin and Sandra Foy, who worked closely with two of Britain's most accomplished mediums, Alan and Diana Bennett, and what they claimed to be a corresponding team of experimenters on the other side. During their 500 sessions, all of which were recorded on audio tape, the Skål experimental group went into a meditative state to connect with their other dimensional counterparts. The goal was to collaborate in devising and conducting experiments that could produce tangible physical phenomena, which could then be studied and analyzed objectively. Robin Foy's remarkable 550-page book, Witnessing the Impossible, chronicles each of these 500 sessions, many of which were observed by visitors, eventually totaling in the hundreds, including top-tier scientists and engineers. The experiment was also monitored by 3 experienced investigators of paranormal phenomena: electrical engineer Arthur Ellison, research psychologist David Fontana, and veteran researcher Montague Keene.
All sorts of things have happened, particularly in this 20th century, which earlier generations would have said were impossible.
Skeptics are often unaware of the amount of experience and the amount of knowledge that goes into investigations of this kind. Between the 3 investigators, you could say we'd had 50 years and more of experiences of this kind. We know all the tricks.
Initially, we were all pretty skeptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out.
The Skål experiment was reported in contemporary magazine articles, 2 books, a 400-page scientific report, and a full-length documentary film. Its successes included nearly 1,000 hours of direct communication through the mediums, and an impressive variety of intriguing physical phenomena such as tiny animated lights that flew around the room. The Skål group also witnessed what they claimed to be the spontaneous appearance of physical objects. Perhaps the most astonishing of these objects were these newspapers, which arrived in mint condition, despite having been published in the 1940s.
We took it to the leading research station in the world on paper and printing, and it was absolutely clear from their report that this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event, and no one has been able to explain how it got there.
In other sessions, a video camera loaded with brand new blank tapes and switched on in a darkened room produced an amazing series of colorful abstract frames. The tapes also contained unexplained light phenomena and enigmatic faces. A conventional 35mm film camera placed on the table in their darkened room initially produced a series of black and white images that the Skoll group were told were faithful duplicates of existing photographs from around the world.
Some were photos of existing photos, and they said initially that was easier for them to do before they went on to photos that had never existed.
Continuing photographic experiments using isolated rolls of film and no camera were carefully controlled by the independent investigators.
We would buy the film ourselves. We would load it into a box. The box was held in the hands of the investigators so that no one could get at it. And then immediately afterwards, we would take it out of the box ourselves so that no one else touched it, and then develop it ourselves in a special machine.
To everyone's surprise, these films revealed a stunning variety of content. This included whimsical drawings and symbols, diagrams, writings and poetry in multiple languages, as well as portraits and signatures of known individuals. The Skoll group also heard voices through a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed.
Yes. Yes, the Skoll experimental group. Experimenting with audio equipment.
Yes.
Historic moment it is.
First record described as an unrelevant consciousness or another dimension.
They also recorded voices that apparently came directly out of the air, most often that of a British engineer, Reg Lawrence, who claimed to have died in 1942 and possessed a special talent for this type of communication. Here's another actual recording made at Skoll, in which Lawrence responds to a question from visiting engineer Walter Schnittger.
Do you see any possibility to describe how you can get the air to vibrate that we can hear it with our ears?
We do not speak. We think in a language we are familiar with.
Yeah.
And by some miracle, I have to say, these energies are transported into the room. Not by me, but by those whose job it is to do that.
These discarnate communicators often demonstrated that while their physical bodies may have turned to dust, their sense of humor had not.
You all right over there, John?
No.
No.
Shut your eyes.
Yeah.
Yes. Think of something very nice. No, not that. Think of an ice cream or something like that.
Yeah, it was.
How do I know that the phenomena come from the afterlife rather than from the mediums themselves? We simply have clues of information which was extremely unlikely to have derived from the mind of the medium. And the more impressive those are, the more likely it is it's an aspect of discarnate communication.
Second-rate scientists would say, well, this so-called paranormal phenomenon cannot have occurred, and therefore it must be conjuring. It must be stage magic. Well, that is not my idea of good science. It's not possible to dismiss the excellent evidence quite so readily.
I could not do it myself as a professional magician. And I don't believe in any magician that I knew could do this. I'd say they were wasting their time doing this here for nothing, when they could be earning $1 million out there on the stage.
If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Skoll experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil.
These things are so extraordinary that when one tells them to people who've not had the experiences themselves, they think, oh, it must be trickery. And the challenge then always is, okay, you duplicate it.
Any questions? Yes?
Why did they stop the experiment?
For a number of reasons. And this is something I don't get into. These, by the way, are trailers for 90-minute documentaries. You're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. At the end of 5 years, they were beginning to get some interference. They had opened this particular channel or doorway or tunnel or however you want to characterize it to the other side. And they were getting some energies that didn't feel right. And this had not happened over this 5-year period, but for some reason at that point it did. And they were advised by their spirit team to stop the experiment. That it had to be shut down at that point because these influences could do some mischief, you might say. And so that's one reason why they did it. They'd also
they were a negative kind of energy that was denigrating in some way.
Yeah, and it's remarkable that they were able to maintain, the right energies and the right vibe for 5 years. I don't think anything like this had been done before or since. Anyway, that's one of the reasons that they did it. They were told that each of the couples could sit separately and do their own experiments, but the four of them weren't to sit together, because it was that combination of energies that needed to be dismantled at that point in time. Okay. Does that make sense?
So they created a portal, but they didn't have complete control over what was going to come through the portal.
Yeah, and we don't understand why. But it's enough to know that sort of thing can happen, and that I think the fact that it was so successful for so long was partly a function of the fact that both couples had had a lot of experience in doing this sort of thing. They were simply trying to take it to a new level, and you might say that in doing so they might have put a little stress on the system and expected it to do to stretch beyond its capacity. And it's just one metaphor for it.
Do you know if when the negative voices began to appear, if the positive ones that they had previously been talking with also were there? Were they both?
My impression is that they were. And that the negatives did not manifest very strongly or persistently, but they were enough to show that the channel had been contaminated or breached or whatever metaphor you want to use.
Had been hacked.
Had been hacked, yeah. Right. Yeah.
But it would be interesting to know what the positive voices would have to say about that.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't there, and I don't have the recordings, so I can't tell you. They don't make too much of that. They were very happy that it went as far as it did. And there was so much more than I could even put into the 90-minute film. You have to read Robin Foy's book, which is based on transcripts of every tape recording they did in each of the 500 sessions. And they did things like they did temperature measurements in the room. The temperature would go down at certain points, and some objective instrumentation. So, and then there's so much more. Anyway, I just love the skull story, and it's not really possible to debunk it when you get into it. So, any other questions? Yes, Jack?
The communication is between people in this life and people who've gone on, presumably, to another life. It's between human beings. So I ask the question in the most simple-minded way. Do dogs go to heaven?
Well, my own conception of the afterlife or the greater reality is something that's continually evolving. Our concepts and our language can't really encompass it. We can just sort of, poke at it and arrive at conclusions that are meaningful to us. I think the short answer to your question is probably yes, that any being that is at all conscious is rooted in what we call the afterlife. I think we're in the afterlife right now. Surprise, surprise. We're just looking through these eyes. There's questions come up from time to time in the realm of communication and mediumship. Well, suppose I go to the other side and I want to connect with my friend who's incarnated. How can I do that? And the answer is always, as far as we've heard, well, part of them is still there. I like the metaphor of the submarine commander looking through the periscope. And in this metaphor, the submarine commander is who we really are, and this periscope is our physical bodies. So as long as we're looking through these bodies in this frequency range, or whatever you want to call it, we have the illusion of being here and functioning in this world. And thanks to our remarkable brains and bodies and biological systems and everything else, the illusion is pretty seamless. So we believe we're here, at least while we're awake and thinking about it. But consciousness itself exists on another level. It's one of the consciousness code. It's my subtitle of my book. Gets at this in a different way.
So would that be the same, almost as saying that time and space is created in our minds, and it's how we function as humans, and it's all good, but it's not real?
Well, this gets into semantics. What do we mean by real?
Our minds can't understand.
Yeah, but we give me the first part of your question again.
I mean, I've heard it many different ways from many different spiritual practices of time and space really being, Alan Watts is one, but time and space being something that we create by necessity. It's how we function through life, but it's something's always here. There's no afterlife, you said. That's what came to mind.
Well, in the book, I point out that there are at least two different meanings for the word time. There's objective time, where you can measure it. It depends on the parameters of our physical system, our orbits, our momentum and inertia, and it's a measure of movement of the change of physical circumstances, you might say. So that's one kind of time. Then there's subjective time, which we all experience in that it flies when we're having fun, and when we're having a bad day, it goes on forever. And I just want to finish this thought that I think once we appreciate the difference between these, it's easier to see that when we either go to the other side after the body expires, or to one extent or another go to the other side when we dream, have lucid dreams, do psychedelic experiences, that we get a more of a sense of what the subjective creation of reality is about. Ordinary dreams are a good example of that. When we're in the dream, for the most part, that's reality to us. We're responding and reacting and acting as if that's, so we don't know any different there. So the question arises then, is that true of our everyday physical lives as well? Certainly our experience is our own. And our universe is our own in that sense. We can have common activities, whether we actually have common experiences or not, there's no way to know. I don't know. I have no idea how you perceive the front of this room. Yes?
I love the emphasis on evidence, and without getting too personal, but over the last few months I've discovered that I have mediumship abilities, and I had a number of successful readings where very concrete, specific evidence, sometimes names, things like that come through, which is really an incredible experience for the sitter. But what really knocked my socks off is remote viewing, even though it's kind of considered mediumship light, so to speak. But the beauty of it is you and a partner who's cooperating with you to hide an object. There's just right then and there objective evidence. If I'm doing a reading, I can bring forth certain specific evidence that really tends to fit the characteristics of a certain person that passed away, but with remote viewing, it's right there. You know, you drew the keys or you drew the shoe or whatever it was. It's sort of just on the spot, immediate validation, and I think I'm so excited about the work that you're doing here because it is a lot about people's personal experiences, and if they haven't had them, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around the idea that it's possible.
Well, this raises another issue, another favorite issue of mine, which is, you know, we call these things paranormal. How do we know how normal or not they are if you can't talk about it? How do we, in the book I say, you know, how do we know our next door neighbors aren't having rollicking conversations with their dead uncles every Wednesday at 9 p.m.? We don't. So, you know, what's paranormal? And what's supernatural? I mean, it depends on your definition. You know, if your definition of nature is this big, then everything out of, you know, here is supernatural. If your definition is this big, you know, nothing's supernatural. So a lot of our perceptions and our confusion about this is really based in our culture, not necessarily in any kind of objective reality. Excuse me, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, you were talking about time, and I've always referred to time. You know, a lot of people don't understand it, they don't have the science background or anything like that. And I said, like the first one you said, it's motion. It's based on motion and what we see. And if there's a complete absence of anything, I mean, if you're in a completely dark chamber and no sense of touch or anything, you still sense time because you know you're going to die. You have that sense of mortality, and time exists because of that, where I don't think is so true with animals. They don't sense they sense danger, but not so much their own mortality, like I'm going to die in 10 years. But if you remove that sense of mortality, like in a near-death experience, then time disappeared. And that happened to me last month. So it was like it was like time meant nothing because time was done.
Well, yeah, it could be our anticipation of mortality, or it could be that we're hungry and waiting for lunch.
Yeah.
Also, the body has its own internal parasympathetic circadian rhythms that follow on its own.
Pineal gland.
Yeah, yeah. It's very anything in connection with the body and the world is going to be very complex. As far as the foundation, what I call the foundation of time, which we label eternity, I had an experience of eternity a few years ago, quite by accident. I was watching a YouTube video, and it was a conversation. Anyone here see the Channeling Eric videos? Right? Eric was this kid from Texas whose mother was a physician, a very skeptical physician. He was a troubled kid, and one day he took his life. And Mama didn't know anything about an afterlife. She was grieving and so on. And then Eric started pulling pranks on his friends, and that got back to Mama, and so Mama got curious, and she connected with a medium named Jamie Butler, who actually spoke here a few years ago. Was anyone here at that session? Well, she's wonderful. She's an amazing medium. She had invited me to her center in Atlanta a few years ago to do a presentation there. And she's the real deal. Anyway, so Eric's mom and Jamie were doing these Skype sessions, and Mama put them on YouTube. And Mama is an interesting character. She can be very blunt sometimes. So she asks Eric, what was it like to shoot yourself? And I heard that, I was shocked. But Eric responded very calmly. He said, Mama, I never heard the shot. I just suddenly found myself in another environment. And that's how the conversation went on. So she asks him, well, are souls born and do they die? And Eric says, well, Mommy, you have to understand that time is a different thing over here. And for some reason, when he said that, I went into the experience of timelessness. And objectively, it might have lasted a half a minute or a minute, but I was definitely there. And my first response to myself was, oh my God, eternity is not just an infinite extension of time. It's something utterly and completely different. And that was a wonderful experience. And it taught me a lot. And I don't have words for it other than that. It's just, you know. So, sorry. Robert.
So what we call magic today, in sometime in the future, may be called science.
Sure. Well, today's science would have been called magic.
Yes.
Not too long ago.
That's right.
I mean, I was halfway through my own life, I would not have believed anything, and I'm a techie, but I would not have believed anything like a smartphone would have been even possible. So, some of that's getting out of control, but that's a whole different different conversation. So, I think we're seeing a kind of a polarization between the hyper technocrats and the AI people, and the real scientists who are digging into the nature of consciousness, and they're doing it in fits and starts. I mean, there's this latest thing some of you may have read about where it's now suspected that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, and that's kind of a step in the right direction. Science always wants to take things apart and find out what make them tick, and the problem with consciousness is it just ticks. It doesn't. It's primary. And at least as I understand it now, and as I think most of you understand it, you can't take it apart. You can't, I forget who said, you can't get behind consciousness. And science really hates that sort of talk, I mean, we can't take it apart and analyze it and find out how it works, because if we could do that, we could control it. Sorry. We can always control it. Within. Yes?
There's a simple experiment you can do around presentiment that I've been doing for a while. If anyone ever watches a football game, try to see if the next play is going to be a positive or a negative experience for you. Of course, it has based on which team you favor. Right. But you can get into the state of mind where you know for sure that the next play is going to be really good or really bad, And it happens seconds before the actual event, which is very much like the experiments they did with presentiment of showing people videos and so on. But anyone can do that and see if they're getting some results there.
When you do that, do you keep a tally of it? See how many you get right, or do you get them all right?
Haven't been doing the tallies, but I've been doing the football game. So far, I've gotten 10 out of 12 right. So I've missed a couple. I can do the football games, but what gets in the way is you get excited. Oh, I've got this special ability, and then you lose it. So you have to be really detached, and it's hard in a game because your emotions are really involved in it.
Right. Yeah, the bony hand of ego reaches up from the crypt.
Right.
Any other questions or experiences? Yes.
Figured that time is a charm.
Sorry.
It's okay. Just side note before my question, they've actually done experiments where, when they have those buttons for dogs and cats where they can speak, that there's videos out there where they're trying to tell their human through a video camera that's connected to them at work that I'm dying, I'm about to die, I'm about to go, or goodbye, about to go. So just an addendum on that. It's very interesting that they could be aware of their own mortality. But my question was, I've had some experience with the spirit box, and I'm just wondering, I didn't use it myself, it was someone using it for me, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
If you mean the gibberish generators that people use to get electronic voice, I feel two ways about it. I think
Could you explain what it is?
Okay, sorry. The electronic voice phenomenon, as represented in my films, is without getting too technical, it's a situation where the voice appears spontaneously in the machine. There are ways of, and it is thought that the inherent noise in the environment and in the electronics is modulated or reformed by the spirit to synthesize the voice. So the thinking goes, well, why don't we create a kind of random noise? Sometimes it's made out of chopped up syllables in English or some other language. It's basically gibberish. And that is played while the recording is being made. And then in playback, you will hear sometimes fully formed, what seem to be fully formed words or sentences that make sense in terms of the question that was asked, for example. And I think it's fine to play with that. The problem with that is that the probability of false positives goes way up. And pareidolia, which means we tend to see what we want to see. You know, in rocks and clouds, we go look at a sky full of clouds, and there's plenty of animals and chess pieces and automobiles and, you know, dogs and cats and fish. So we have to be careful of that. So there's a certain kind of threshold of robustness, you might say, that we really want to go for. And that doesn't mean we can't play around and experiment and do these things. I just think we have to be careful of our conclusions. For some years I worked with a remarkably psychic friend of mine using a Ouija board. And you know, a lot of people get into trouble using a Ouija board because they're just playing around with it and without any kind of discrimination. We sat down and we did a white light meditation before each session, and for a number of years running we got some quite amazing communications, including, I don't know if I should get into this story because it takes a while, but I asked a question one day and the board said, well, it's not our department. We'll call in someone who can answer your question. And it was an ET related question. So what we got was a very, very strong, powerful kind of masculine energy came into the room, and the board was moving like crazy, and this character introduced himself by name. And long story short, after some dialogue, it turned out that this presence claimed to be one of a group that had come here from a galaxy that was so far that they could not come here physically. They came in their etheric bodies, and then they mentally constructed a working environment. And I said, well, is it like a craft, like a spaceship? And they said, no, not exactly. It's hard to do. I said, well, okay, get poetic. And so they said, okay, imagine a bird with consciousness throughout its body, but with a center. That's what they said. They said there were a dozen or so of these entities that worked together. And we said, well, where are you right now? And they said, we are high over Rio de Janeiro and in the room here with you. Another time we asked them where they were. They said, we're over Cuba watching a baseball game. So we're intrigued with your mass spectator sports. They don't know what to make of them. Anyway, they gave us actual names for these beings. And around that time, I had talked to someone. Are you familiar with the Odeon Monastery that's up in Sonoma County? It's this beautiful Tibetan monastery. It was built about 20 years ago. And I was talking to someone who was on the construction crew. And he said, well, we've been seeing these strange lights coming over at night. So a friend of mine, Anna, and I went up there one night and drove up to where the construction site was, and we parked in a little dirt parking area. And right next to us was this huge pen full of chickens jumping all around. We parked, and as we turned the engine off, we were in complete silence. We didn't even look at each other and acknowledge it. We both got it. We experienced complete and utter silence for maybe 2-3 minutes. It was quite an experience. Then some people came along and broke the silence, and they showed us around the place and so on. Anyway, we then went and drove around the area to find a place where we could sort of make camp for the night and watch the sky and see if anything showed up. So we found a field where we could drive in there and lay down some blankets and kind of settle in for the evening. And this is in Sonoma County, about 4 miles inland from the ocean, near Stewart's Point Road, if any of you know that area. And so we could just see the surface of the ocean from where we were. So I'm mentioning to Anna this Ouija board story about these folks from wherever they are. And so I mentioned the name that was given to us. And as I mentioned the name, we get 3 bright flashes on the horizon right where we're looking. Mm-hmm. And, well, that's interesting. And then a couple hours later, we're lying on our backs looking straight up at the sky. And I mentioned the same name again. 3 bright flashes exactly where we're looking. And then we see a moving light going across the sky kind of like that. And then it kind of got lost in the haze. So that was interesting. So that was our adventure for the evening. And we decided we would get back up, and about a month or 2 later, and we'd bring some joints with us, see what happened. So we went up there, found the same field, and made camp for the night. And Anna gives me a toke, and I'm very sensitive to weed. Whenever I don't do it very often anymore, but anytime I've done it, I just take a little micro toke just to see how I react. So I take my micro toke, in about 30 seconds I'm falling asleep. I say, Anna, what's in this stuff? She says, I don't know, I use it all the time. I said, well, just bang, I'm out. Totally out. Next thing I know, I'm waking up, Anna's asleep, and she's moving in a way that's kind of like she's having a bad dream or something. So I didn't wake up. I waited for her to wake up herself, and she reported her experience, which is that she's looking out at the field, and this craft comes down. A couple of little gray guys get out, and they beckon to her to come towards them. And she said, so I did. I moved towards them, and the closer I got, the weirder I felt. She said, the closer I got to them, the more I was participating in their consciousness. Wow. And it was so utterly different, utterly strange, that I couldn't deal with it, and I had to back off. And they weren't hostile or anything like that, but it was just the sheer strangeness of tasting this completely alien consciousness and perception. Anyway, it was whether it was actually physical or not, I don't know. I doubt it. It was probably a astral, etheric, whatever label you want to apply, the next frequency. So we went back and asked the Ouija board about this, and it said this was as tentative an experience for them as it was for you. Mm. It was like a little experiment. It says, if you want to go back and continue it, feel free to do so, but you don't have to. And we decided against it. So we didn't get further into it. But it was quite, even though I didn't experience it myself, just having the business of being put to sleep, I'd never experienced that before. And that was obviously part of the whole thing. So, there are more things in heaven and earth. Okay, enough about me. Any more questions? Yes?
I noticed you had a quote by Seth up there. Is that the Jane Roberts Seth? And
yeah.
What do you think of her? And Esther Hicks, for that matter.
I don't know Esther Hicks' work that well. Come on. I think Seth was a good teacher. I say was. He's still around. He still comes through from time to time. One of the mediums I work with started working with him a couple of years ago, and it was so intense and so densely filled with information that she had to stop. She had other things happening in her life. But she sent me the recordings, and I did some transcripts of those, and It was quite something. He was talking about different, I'm trying to think of the terminology he used, or different universes, different reality systems. And again, I forget the terms he used to distinguish them. And he said that he can exist in some of these systems, but not in others. That the vibration is just too different from where he comes from. And I'm familiar with a lot of channeling of this particular medium, and the energy that came through was just unbelievable. And you can just see it in the words.
The funny thing is, I named my son Seth, and everybody thinks that it's in the Bible, but it was because that book was a real life changer.
So yeah, there's so much that we have left to learn that we probably already know on the other side. But bringing it through, to a planet that's going through such incredible stress and change is it's a very interesting and important thing, I think, right now.
How about the Course in Miracles? Have you done any?
I never really studied it. There's the one quote I remember from it is Jesus saying that in the Bible I'm quoted as saying many things I did not actually say. So, and that's, I think, all I needed to read of that. Yes?
Of what you were saying about the planet going through such a difficult time, do we have any reason to believe that there are beings or energy or something rooting for us to succeed?
Yes.
Good.
That's the short answer. Yeah, and I think one thing that is, I can't prove this, but I tend to believe it, is that the higher the consciousness, the less the likelihood of overt physical intervention. That the higher the consciousness, the more interest they have in raising our vibrations, and not doing too much for us. I think we're all familiar with the idea that Earth life, as we know it, is a kind of experiment in the development of consciousness. And that the prime directive is real and important, which is you don't try to overtly influence a developing civilization, because that just short circuits the experiment. So they can influence us by inspiring us, inspiring in the technological space, inspiring people to invent things that are genuinely helpful and useful and not dangerous. There's a lot that's coming through now that can be used for good or ill. I mean, the ability for digital systems to read our thoughts is now a real thing. That handicapped people who've lost the power of speech can think the words, and they're displayed. And so so many of these technologies can be helpful. Fine, but if they're used, obviously, if they're used for the wrong purposes, then they empower the wrong purposes. Yes?
I don't know where it came to this understanding, but I'm just curious with your work with mediums that I had the idea or envisioned that after people die that there's like different levels of planes, and that shortly after passing that they're closer to our reality here, but as the years 10, 20, 30 or 100 years that they slowly fade, that their consciousness kind of disappears.
Yeah, you can think of that process as a multi-story building. There's the mineral kingdom, which would be the soil of the foundation, and the animal kingdom would be the first floor or so, and maybe we're on the second floor. And when we pass, we first go to the next floor. Some of us may go up several floors, depending on where we were when we came in. And when you go all the way to the top, there's no limits. There's no ceiling, no walls. Right? That would be in this metaphor, that would be the absolute. But as far as there being discrete levels, I was reading something the other day that included different people's accounts of these various stages. And they were all somewhat different. It was Swedenborg and I'm trying to think of, if I had gotten more sleep last night, I could tell you the names of the others. And they all posited these levels, but they were all a little different. And what I'm wondering is whether these were simply imperfect perceptions of an actual structure, or whether there are different structures. Some of them may have 5 levels, some may have 3, and presumably the one you come from is the one you go back to. Again, I can't swear to that, but the idea is that when we think of there's this, simplistically, there's this one picture of the afterlife. I don't think so. I think it's more interesting and there's more variety in it, even structurally, for different entities, different souls, as well as different rates at which they may rise or even come down to communicate with us. One of the mediums I work with, we have had, it was a period when we were doing Zoom sessions every week or so, and our meetings would be crashed by Robin Williams. You cannot make Robin Williams up, I promise you. And he is absolutely hilarious. And then he can get very serious. He talked a lot about his family, about his illness, and so on. And he's actually working with a lot of mediums around the world. And he said explicitly, I'm committed to staying close to the earth plane so that I can build these bridges and help and use whatever talents I have to enhance this communication. And there are others who've come through. We put together a website. It's called cosmicvoices.network. Cosmic Voices is one word, .network. And we have a page that's got 2 columns of channelings. One is names that you will recognize, another is names you will not recognize. And the ones you won't recognize include, I'm trying to think of his first name, his last name is Callahan. He was the fire captain, New York City fire captain during 9/11. And his experience of passing over is quite fascinating and moving. He got in touch more recently too, after a period of time had passed, and how things had changed for him and for his men who died with him, who still regarded him as their captain to some extent and their guide. So anyway, cosmicvoices.network, and it's I refer to it in my book, but it's a fun read. I mean, there's I'm trying to think of Neil Armstrong comes through and tells the story of his passing, which is one of the most moving things I've ever read. The mediums in question, their names are Jean Love and Regina Ochoa, and they're best known for channeling the Challenger and Columbia astronauts after they died. And there's a whole website devoted to those channelings, which you can get to through the Cosmic Voices Network. I filmed some of these sessions, and they were quite extraordinary. The commander of the Columbia, I don't know if you remember what happened to the Columbia. When the space shuttle comes back into the atmosphere, everything heats up. So they have these ceramic tiles on the bottom of the craft. And during the launch, one of those tiles was damaged. And there's a whole political aspect to these stories too, because NASA could have set up another space shuttle as a lifeboat. It would have been too expensive. So, because they knew something probably happened, but there was no way to inspect the bottom of the craft other than by setting up another space shuttle, which they could have done. There was one that was close enough to launch prep that they could have done it in a few days. They didn't. So what happened was the part of the craft got burned through. It became depressurized. All the atmosphere went out. The crew, who had part of their training is hypoxia practice, where they're in a chamber and they slowly drain the oxygen out of it, and you're trained to recognize those responses in your body and try to overcome them as best you can. So they tried to get their helmets on, their oxygen equipment going, but the craft broke up too quickly. the commander felt responsible for this and held this guilt for years on the other side. And in one of the sessions that we did a few years ago, Regina, one of the mediums, had volunteered to discharge that energy physically, it was so strong in him that apparently that was the only way that it could be cleared.
Apparently
And,
what? Would you say that again? Apparently what?
Well, that discharging it through a physical body was the only way to completely let it go. And so Regina volunteered to be that vehicle. And I got video of this. And she was, she suffered. And her blood pressure went up and all that. And she was okay. But we were all there, a bunch of us were in the room, and we were standing by to help her if possible. But she said, no, this has to happen. And evidently it was effective. So who knows, how many other people have gone through similar trauma and holding that with no means to do it in this way, which I suppose means that it would take much more time on the other side to discharge those energies. And yeah, there's a perception of time on the other side, perception of elapsed time and experience. It doesn't equate one-to-one with our time frame, but there is you're in subjective time there, so there is a passage of events. How uniform it is from one soul to another, I think is an interesting question. I think probably it's not that uniform, and what we bring with us when we go to the other side will determine sort of a baseline for our perception of time, the passage of time. So they can still talk about time there, but it's subjective. And if two or more individuals are tuned into each other, working together or playing together or whatever, presumably their senses of time will be more synchronized. But someone over here who's in a completely different state of consciousness, it might be unrolling 10 times as fast or 10 times slower. That's, anyway, yes?
So it sounds like, based on what you were saying about that commander feeling responsible, it makes me wonder if the way a person has lived in this life transfers over, like for Hitler, for example, or Trump, or I mean, I don't want to put those two together.
Yeah, they're always good. Both are always good for a laugh.
Those personalities carry some of that baggage with them.
Right. In the case of the astronauts and the shuttle crews, most of these were military people. They came from an Air Force background. So they had a strong sense of responsibility, of discipline, so on. Some of the crews were, talking about the politics of this. Turns out that on every shuttle flight, one of the crew had been trained as a psychic. This was an experimental program based on the Army and the SRI work. And the idea was that if they lost communication, maybe they could communicate psychically. So one person on each crew was so trained. Problem with that is that these crews were like family. And this secret was being kept from the rest of the crew. They only found out about it after they died. And in the case of the Challenger, everyone was rather pissed off when they found out, and there had to be some reconciliation there. That one of them was keeping a secret. In the case of the Columbia, the psychic was an Indian woman named Kalpana Chawla, and she did not come through the military line, but she was born in India and was already psychic. And when they put her through the training, she pretended to not get it, just to kind of to soft pedal her talents and make them think they were doing their job. When the craft broke up, and when it actually broke up, it was really violent. The wreckage was spread across 3 states. She went out of her body like that, easy peasy, helped her colleagues out of their bodies, to the extent that she could. Visited India. First went into a space representing the music and art of her culture. Visited her family in India, who she says were aware of her presence, and then came back to work with the crew to help them through the rest of their experience. She, when she came through in one of these sessions, she addressed each one of us in the room, saying that she had visited our homes, so that she enjoyed the altar that one person had in their home, that sort of thing. And very kind of sweet and strong personality. One of the crew was a photographer, and what he said was he was photographing the ship all the way down. It was not with a physical camera, but that's what he had imagined he had in his hands. And he made some technical references to his equipment. So I went, skeptic that I am, and I looked it up. And yes, he got it absolutely right as to the kind of equipment they were using. So at that time, the first digital cameras, early digital cameras, and hard drives and stuff like that. So yeah, I find this endlessly fascinating, reassuring, of course, and when you muck about in infinity, there's always more, So I'm eager to find out what's next in this whole process for me. Yes.
I have sort of a off-topic question, but I'm very interested in non-human communicating with non-human intelligence, and I understand the whole thing about the prime directive. You're not supposed to give a primitive society technology that they might use to create weapons and so on. But I don't understand why we couldn't get a philosophical perspective from people who are more advanced, who've been had their civilizations have gone on, maybe. And I want to know, for example, who are the aliens who are here? Which ones can we trust, and which ones do we not trust? What is their agenda, and so on? Do you know of anyone who's using these interdimensional tools to try to access this information about aliens?
That's a great question. I've heard of people who have done it or attempted to do it. The problem is, who are you going to believe? If the bad guys masquerade as good guys, which they often do, and we think in terms of good and bad, which is kind of a simplistic dichotomy. But I think it's, as with a lot of this, it's an individual question. I think you'd have to ask a particular person who has had these kinds of experiences and find out from them. I mean, you hear about a lot of this stuff, but unless you actually look into it, get to know the person, become a friend and confidant, and dig down beneath the surface of it, it's all just second and third hand information. There's I'm trying to think of his name. He had a sort of a spiritual group in Boulder some years ago, and he wrote a series of books called Wisdom from the Greater Reality. I think was the first one. I'll think of his name in a minute. And his main thing was, we're encountering all of these alien presences. Again, the question, who do we trust? He says the main thing we need to do in all of this is to come from our own terrestrial sovereignty, so that we don't fall for either threats or temptations. If we come from that position, that we're not overwhelmed and jazzed by all the high-tech interdimensional stuff that's going on, but we say, we represent this society, and work from that place.
Earth
that
first.
We will be best.
Earth first.
Yeah. So what can you really give us that we need, kind of thing. My impression is that it's a zoo out there. That if we knew the variety of life and consciousness that exists, just over the horizon of our perception, they'd have to lock us up because it's, we've been isolated here psychically and physically for a long time. It's been a long experiment, and there have been many experiments. I mean, you go to the in the realm of what's called forbidden archaeology, where you go back way back, and you find artifacts in levels of strata that that represent inconceivable lengths of time. So this is just one little cycle here that we're going through, and we're in a bit of a isolation or quarantine to a great extent for good reason, and we need to learn to clean up our own nest and not necessarily ask for help in the wrong way. Has anyone read any of the books by Phil Kroff? He was K-R-A-P-F. He was a news editor at the Los Angeles Times and retired a few decades ago, and was sitting in his living room one day and all of a sudden found himself aboard a huge spaceship. It's like the size of a city. And he was told by the inhabitants of this craft, who were about 5 feet tall, kind of looked like your typical aliens, that this ship was part of an effort. They call it an ambassadorship program, where people in positions of influence in various Earth cultures would be invited aboard, introduced to one another, and educated in part of the bigger picture. And then at a certain point, all these people who were supposed to be influential people in their societies, in their countries, would all come out at once and say, yes, we all had this experience and this is what's going on. And this program is one of ambassadorship, of making these first connections between them and us. He wrote 2 books about this. His last experience was in 2000, early 2001. He came and spoke at Fort Mason here. It was just before 9/11, a few weeks before 9/11, I think. And I went there and actually videotaped his whole talk. And I did it all in close-up to see if I could find any deception or fudging or clean. And he talked about his experience in some detail. And he's a salt of the earth guy. He didn't know anything about any of this stuff when this happened to him. And he was tapped to. They asked him to write a white paper, on this ambassadorship program. He ended up writing 2 books eventually. But after 9/11 happened, he found himself teleported aboard this craft again, and was told that the program was being shut down. And so nothing further happened with that. And Kroff passed away a few years after that.
Would you spell his name, the person?
K-R-A-P-F.
K-R-A-P-F.
It's Kroff. He pronounced it Kroff. Philip Kroff. And the first book is called The Contact Has Begun. And I forget the name of the second book. Anyway, so he was this innocent character who got snatched up and given an assignment and wrote this very fascinating material about it. Another writer since then has theorized that the so-called ambassadorship program was part of a colonization program. And that it's a good thing it did not continue. Now, I don't have any opinion about it one way or the other, but I'm bringing it up to make this point, that on the assumption that these folks are at least in some ways more sophisticated than we are, to be careful of manipulation, particularly if they dangle stuff in front of us that looks...
We wouldn't do that.
Hmm?
We wouldn't.
Oh, no, of course we'd never do anything like that.
Just ask the Native Americans.
Yeah, right. So, it's a zoo out there. And here we are.
It's a zoo in here, too.
It sure is.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said you watched the videotape of this Croft
Yeah.
Closely.
Yeah.
For what?
Well, just to see if I could catch him, lying, basically, or stretching the truth in some way. He certainly, to my eye, he certainly didn't betray anything like that. The only time he got at all uptight was when someone brought up the subject of skeptics, who had attacked him, of course, and he stiffened up. He kind of went like this, Otherwise, he was just pretty relaxed and relating to the audience in the room, so on.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
So, do you think that all these people that are coming forth with information about what the government is hiding, do you think that's going to change anything?
Another very good question. Well, I like to say that what I think doesn't matter, but I don't know. I like to think so. I like to think that the process isn't hijacked by the same parties that would want to shut it down. What's happened over time is like every 10 years, like someone writes a book, like Leslie Kean's book, which you might be aware of. It's called UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. She's a friend of mine, used to live in San Rafael. She's also a New York Times reporter now, lives in New York.
What is her name?
Leslie Kean, Kean. She's written several books, and she's also been instrumental in the latest revelations that have come out. But this sort of thing kind of happens every 10 years, and then a whole new generation says, "Oh my goodness, UFOs!" And then it's quiet. They tamp it down for another 10 years, and then it rears its head again, and rinse, repeat. This time it's a little different, and we're all kind of watching to see how effective the cover-up and the various strategies that are used to cover it up or minimize it, or try to statements come out that avoid the more convincing aspects of the evidence. Some of it's the same old crap, but we'll see. We'll see. I mean, if the likes of Chuck Schumer get involved and say, we need to have a report on it, we know something has changed. So we'll see.
It seemed like the time that they had a group of people that were going to descend on Area 51, and they came out and said, there's an unbelievable amount of people that believe this is happening, and you're not going to be able to control the crowds if you keep this up. It seemed like from that point on, things started to open up quite a bit more as far as documentaries and 60 Minutes and...
Yeah, it seems to have waxed and waned over the years. I think James Fox's work has been really good in the area of documentaries. Anyone here see his latest one that was shown here last month?
Yeah.
He went down to Brazil and researched a case that happened in 1996? 1996, yeah. In a town of Varginha, Brazil, where there had been a UFO crash and retrieval. And it's one of the legendary cases in the UFO literature, but no one's ever gone down there and really done a documentary. So James went down there a few years ago, and he had originally been skeptical about it. He'd heard about it, but it took a couple of his friends to prod him to go down there and do this. So he did, and he produced an excellent documentary, finding some of the people who'd witnessed the crash. One guy who they took out to the country, to the area where the crash occurred, and he was looking for it, and said, no, it wasn't this hill, there was a house there. So they went to the next hill, and there was the area, and the guy burst into tears. So it's that kind of testimony. He interviewed people from the Army who had witnessed the disposition of the bodies. They interviewed a group of women who had seen one of the creatures alive in the town, and they were extremely credible and highly emotional about it. They interviewed the staff in the hospital where one of the bodies was brought And the military guy who was in charge of the body died of an infection that he received from that body. It's a very complicated and fascinating story. So James, as he finished that documentary, and he told me that he's got, since he did that, more information has come to him, and he may go down again and do a follow-up.
When did that happen?
1996. And the U.S. military came in, by the way, and grabbed all of the hardware, and just went right into Brazil without any kind of authorization, grabbed it and left. And that's the kind of thing that's happened in many of these crash retrieval cases.
What's the purpose of trying to hide it for them?
Well, I think for starters, there's no it. There's such a variety of things, a variety of alien origins, alien purposes. Some may be nefarious, some may be intentionally helpful, some may be just exploratory. We don't know.
Not meant for the government to try to hide it. Shut it down.
Well, there's several kind of basic reasons. One is that, as you probably heard, there's a great deal of back engineering of recovered alien technology. It's been going on since the 40s. And that is undercover for obvious military reasons. If we have command of whiz-bang technology that's going to outperform our enemies, well, of course it's going to be kept under wraps.
I'm sure all of us here have had certain experiences either through transcendental meditation or meditation spaces or studying non-dualism or having a spiritual awakening which allowed you to see beyond the scope of you're here in this dense world and that there's a higher vibrational field that we can all connect to through the veil. And I'm curious what that moment of timelessness was for you, of being what Eckhart Tolle talks about, of being completely engrossed in the moment. Mm-hmm. And there's timelessness and spacelessness. And when you hear near-death experiencers talk about it, they talk about this space of timelessness. And when they come back into their body, it's a totally new trajectory for them. It's a whole new experience. And sometimes they divorce their spouses because they don't understand. They're a totally new journey in their life. So I'm very curious about that.
I was there last month.
Yeah.
Same one.
On December 18th, I had a craniotomy to have a tumor removed.
Oh, wow.
And I was under general anesthesia for over 10 hours.
Wow.
And I refer to it as my 10-hour blink of an eye. I mean, time-wise, it felt like a second, but yet I was somewhere else. I describe it as just being surrounded by peace, love, understanding. Everything made sense. It was all so simple, but yet we mess it up. We just can't treat each other nice. It's just, it goes, biblically it goes to like the 2 commandments, love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. It's just that simple. But yet we're so, but it was dark but light, and then there was a strong light on the left, and it's just, at the very end of it, it was saying, okay, I had to leave the light on the left. And then I came out of it and start talking about stuff, and that goes nowhere. And I was surprised. I was really surprised that Stanford does not have a counselor or someone that has knowledge of this sort of stuff, whether they want to believe it's real or not. Someone there to talk to you, and I've had to.
Down the hall at SRI. That's pretty good.
Yeah,
that was then.
See, I've had to do reading. You know, I started with Bruce Grayson after. And I found one thing from 40 years ago, a paper that he wrote 40 years ago online, read that, and then looked him up, and then found after, read through that in, I don't know, a day and a half. And I'm not a big reader, but I've read like 9 books in this last month, just taking everything in because nobody wants to talk about it. And nobody wants to, they just say, oh, well, that's just a side effect. That's just a side effect of the anesthesia.
There is a ton of YouTube videos that you can watch.
It's not that they don't want to talk about it. It's just that
one of the most interesting ones is Next Level Soul.
Yeah.
He just interviewed Lottie Valentine, who's out of Arizona. But that's one main source.
The Next Level Soul.
I read your book. I read
Dan's book.
Lisa, no, not Lisa.
Smart.
Bolte Taylor. She's a doctor. Jill Bolte Taylor. She had a stroke, and it's just hearing these descriptions, and I just keep coming across. There it is. There it is. There it is. That's exactly what it was. But then you deal with, like I can't talk to my wife about it because she doesn't want to talk about it.
I'm sorry.
And then she gets quiet, and then I think she's upset, and then it's like, okay, we just won't bring up this topic. And I mean, she's here. She's at the hotel. She let me. I told her I was coming to do this.
Does she have a particular religious orientation, or?
No, she's a. I don't believe, but I respect everybody's beliefs.
I was just wondering where she in particular was coming from.
She doesn't like learning anything. And she is self-proclaimed, not very smart, but it's not just this. I mean, even before this, if I try to tell her something, teach her something new, she did, because I've got my master's degree in, taught physics and chemistry and math and.
It's tough if you're close to someone who's not in your universe in that way. And,
but there should be a group that he could.
Well, that's why I found this. I found this looking through ions.
Where did you come from?
Well, keep paying attention to us because we're trying to hold meetings at least once a month, either here, El Cerrito, or someplace in the Bay. Napa wants to get started as well to get a group there.
And
so with our email list, and keep an eye on it. And if we do want, other than having a speaker like Dan, the group we're going to have here, as well as someone in El Cerritos, is if you have an experience and you want to share it, then you can share that and get some support.
Just one thing, just a little announcement that Lori has asked me if she wants asked me to organize the ongoing events here. So we'll make that happen.
Than you had before.
So sorry.
That's okay. I'm sorry.
So I was mentioning that Lori Grace, who's the director here, has asked me to start to pull together regular events here, and we'll do it in coordination with IANS and.
For many years, we had a monthly near-death speaker, someone come and speak, and it was guided by Ellie Shamber and Lewis Griggs, who both have had their own experiences. And it's kind of fallen by the wayside in the last few years, and we're happy that Dan and perhaps Kent will help to start scheduling on a regular basis again. It used to be either the first or fourth Friday of the month. So our intention is to do it. You're on our mailing list. You'll get announcements of all of our events, but especially the near-death events. Or you can always just check out our website and see what's.
And then Rich helps with the mailing list on our El Cerrito meeting, and I try and do that like the fourth Sunday of the month, like 4 to 7. So we have a meeting and then we have a potluck afterwards. The other thing to pay attention to is New Living Expo is coming up here on April 19th, 20th, and 21st up at the Marin Civic Center. And we'll have Dan Sheehan up there for the UFO talk, and he's currently involved with Congress in setting up a place in Washington, D.C. across from the Capitol to vet the information that's coming out of the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. And then we also have Suzanne Giesman coming in as a near-death experience speaker and as a psychic medium. And
she's
amazing. About her, she was,
I just went to her
when 9/11 hit, she was the assistant to the Joint Chief of Staff on her way on an airplane to see the Queen of England. Then they had to turn around. They came back, flew over the Twin Towers, and she walked through the Pentagon after they landed. And because of the way she was raised, very strictly by the book, very regimental, seeing all that death really disturbed her. So she went and talked to her husband, who was a captain, destroyer captain, and said, we've got to retire. So about 4 years later, they retired. They took 4 years to go up and down the eastern seaboard to practice sailing, and then they sailed to Croatia. Once she got over to Croatia, she had some bad news finally. She thought, you know, everything was fine, we're retired, everything's just fine and dandy, right? She's always had an interest in metaphysical, didn't do much. But then her stepdaughter, her husband's daughter, who was in the Marines and pregnant, got killed by got struck by lightning and died. So then they came back to D.C. She knew she had one opportunity, if she could, to get hold of a medium to prove that there was more. When she was looking at her daughter's body, she just said, there's got to be more life than this, instead of just this person that's there. So for years, she meditated. For several years, she kept meditating. Her daughter's name was Susan. She said, Susan, come. You know, I believe in you. You're around. I know you're around. Show me something. So finally, she went to a medium, just a general overall reading. And she wound up sitting next to somebody who was also a medium and a New York Times author, best-selling author. And she said, this is the person I need to talk to. So she grabbed her husband, made an appointment in D.C., and she knew she only had one opportunity because her husband was strictly by the book, right? Career Navy. Didn't believe in any of this hocus-pocus stuff. So the medium said, hey, husband sits outside, I'll do your reading. But when the medium started to read her, the medium finally said, you got to bring your husband in. That's when the evidence was given to both of them that the daughter was still around. And that kind of opened the door for Suzanne and her husband. And then she wound up in another medium reading, and the medium called her up and said, hey, go read this gentleman. And Suzanne said, wait a minute, I don't know how to read this person. And she started doing a couple of things and she got it right. So then that's when the medium told her, you got to get yourself trained. So she started learning, and she took herself to the Arthur Findlay School in England to get trained as a medium, and that's what she does now. She's national.
Yeah, she's
so
also...
she'll be in town on April 20th.
She's a very great evidential medium. Very good at picking up
medium. So she'll give you, if she does a reading for you, she'll give you evidence. But you can look on her YouTube videos too for her podcast and stuff.
I just came back from Savannah.
What?
I just came back from Savannah
Yeah.
for a 2-day class with her.
Oh, wonderful.
And it was great, and I'm going back in April for part 2 of the class.
Oh, great, good.
Yeah.
What's your aim in doing this work?
Continuing to strengthen the clairs and be able to do mediumship readings and a little bit of channeling.
Right. What's your background in this area? Was this something relatively recently discovered? Was this something
the mediumship completely brand new discovery, only in the last 4 months. However, probably around the age 14, I routinely would have objects fly around the room. So
oh, is that all?
So pictures would fly off the walls, my bag fly across the room, my pen jump off my desk, some of it kind of in front of my eyes, most of it a little bit to the side. It would always come accompanied with like almost this sonic boom sound. So I could always sort of tell if it happened in another room that I wasn't in, what that was about.
How did you react to that? Were you scared or
I was
intrigued?
scared at first when I was a teenager. I was scared of it. And then in my early 20s, I was scared of it. And at some point, I just realized it wasn't trying to harm me. And it wasn't dangerous. And in fact, I had a number, as soon as I made that realization, and actually spoke to whatever it was, it really changed and became more interactive and more intentional.
How long was it between when this first started happening and when you moved in this direction of a dialogue?
Like 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah. It took. I really. I was tickled by it, but a little cautious, and I didn't want to mess around with it. I was just afraid. And then last year, I had 2 visitation dreams, and then the activity really started escalating, and basically...
What's the activity? You're talking about physical phenomena.
Yeah, like a plate that was clean and sitting on my kitchen tabletop just exploded. And the pieces went into like 2 different rooms, and I was on a Zoom with someone in my office when it happened, and terrified, and I called up a medium, and during that conversation changed everything for me.
How so?
Even if she hadn't sort of told me what she did, she sort of said this kind of like protective prayer sort of thing at the beginning of the call, and I felt like I had stuck my finger in a electrical socket as she said it. It was very physically palpable. That's the perfect word. I was so surprised by all this, and in talking with her, she sort of said, well, they're clearly trying to get your attention because you have something to do here with this, and try to be less fearful of it and be more curious. And it basically just opened a completely unexpected journey and totally changed the way I look at everything.
How did you end up relating to this presence? I mean, these are what are classically called poltergeist activity. Yeah. And that's often, as far as I know, a result of someone who hasn't passed over all the way.
Well,
now, does this fit your experience?
No. She had said that it was my grandpa, and she described so many details about his life to a T. It was pretty hard for me to not believe it was not him. And since then, my grandpa's come up in other readings that I've done with other mediums. He's kind of always front in line, and he communicates with me about my mom. This is my mom's dad, and he'll, for example, he did this just a few weeks ago, he'll knock my family photo off with my mom in it, and put a book on top, because I needed to call her about something. So it'll come with a knowingness now, which is new. But anyway, I started doing readings just in the last few months. The first one I did was on my Uber driver, and it just started coming to me. And anyway, it's sort of just developed into a calling. Yeah.
And what kind of service do you see yourself providing to others in this work?
Oh my goodness. I think for me, what's really the most important for me is the healing value of it. I think we get so wrapped up in our human story, and to know that life is much longer a trajectory than what we necessarily see in front of our noses, has the ability to resolve wounds that, you know, decades of therapy might not be able to address in the way that one moment of getting an apology from a loved one across the veil can.
Yeah.
So I think that is a huge thing for me. And I've gotten communications in the most magical ways. From song lyrics with the perfect message for that person coming through. Sometimes it's visual images, sometimes it's body, sometimes it's just knowingness. A lot of times it's snags, just paying attention to something. And for example, this happened just like 2 weeks ago. This sounds so goth, but I was walking through a graveyard with my partner and our dog, and I had just noticed that some of the graves have pictures on them, and we started running around looking at all the graves with the pictures. And this was a big cemetery.
Where was this?
In Oakland.
Oh, the big one there that has the big mortuary center there. Yeah.
Yes. And we were on one side of the road, and we probably spent 5 minutes running around looking at the graves with pictures. And across the road, maybe 2 rows in, I noticed one particular grave. And I couldn't see anything on it, it was too far away. And I said to my partner, you know, my grandma, Leocadia, also has a picture on her grave. And I spotted that grave way over there. I go straight to it. The name on the grave is Leocadia. And it was just sort of like, hi grandma, you know, thanks for that snag. And it's a rare Polish name even in Poland, let alone in a cemetery in Oakland. So it was just, those kinds of things bring a lot of magic, joy, and beauty, and an expansiveness that kind of helps you put your guns down a little bit in your life.
Amen. As
a divorce attorney, it's tremendously changed the way I practice.
Wow.
How so?
Different worlds.
I spend a lot more time with my clients emphasizing compassion, flipping the story around a little bit for them, and just trying to go about it in the least harmful way.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for, I'm sorry, I wasn't expecting to.
No, it's perfect.
Just segue on that about the way you change. It's like I took, my first name is Peter, and I felt I need, for some reason, I created an acrostic with my name, which is patience, empathy, tolerance, enlightenment, and respect. 5 things that I feel compelled that I need to work on. And in my whatever it was, I was also told, in my mind, I was told 22 years. I don't know what it means, but I'm feeling like that means that's what I've got left.
Yeah.
And I get, I need to work on these things and do what I can with this time that I have.
Cool. Yeah. And it's good for you to know that, to have your experience validated, and that there are other people also, like he was talking about on YouTube and books, and more that experience is coming out of the closet.
Yeah, I had to, learn. I couldn't just hold it in and not say anything. I just would have made me crazy.
Well, thank you. Wow. Well, thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
And